I'm David Klaus, the Consulting Director of the Wilson Center on the Hill program. Welcome to this program, which we are pleased to do jointly with the Wilson Center's China Environmental Forum. Just a few brief announcements before I turn the program over to Jennifer Turner, the director of that program. First, in the middle of your table, you'll see this card. On the back of that card is an opportunity for you to put your name, your email address, and to check off some of the issues that you may be interested in. What that will do is it'll mean that if we put out a report on the Latin America program or on Brazil or something like that, put out a report, or you'll get more announcements, then you'll get a copy of that. You'll also probably get announcements of programs that are held at the Wilson Center. Wilson Center on the Hill holds about 15, 20 programs a year here on Capitol Hill so as to bring the Wilson Center to you. But if you check those boxes, you'll be informed of issues and programs and things that we're doing down at the Reagan Building. So please fill out that card if you're interested. Secondly, if you haven't already and you would like to get more information about Wilson Center on the Hill programs, leave your card or leave your information at the front desk and we will add you to the list. Frankly, it's in our interest, since we sell that at about $1 a pop. No, just joking. If we do not sell the list if you want to be removed from the list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 3 program announcements for the future. We have a program on the Iranian elections with Robin Wright, who is writing a book on that. That program is scheduled for the first week of June. The date to be determined. I think that's in advance. I believe the Iranian elections are on the 12th. She has very, very great and thoughtful insights on that. On June 12th, we have a very interesting program on education in America. And the program is going to feature 4 or 5 Einstein Fellows. Einstein Fellows are selected from teachers across America who display excellence, and they take a year and come to Washington and get engaged in the policy process. 4 or 5 of the Einstein Fellows who are just completing their year in Washington are going to talk about what's going to make a difference in American education, having spent time actually in the classroom, having basically committed to spending their careers in the classroom. They're going to share with you some insights and thoughts about how the Washington policy process might improve education in America. And then on June 26th, we have a program which is called What is a National Development Policy and Why the U.S. Needs One? I think that it attempts to sort of broadly look at the whole question of exactly how is the United States spending its money in from all of its different pockets, whether it be agriculture, defense, foreign aid, what the State Department does, et cetera. How can we wrap that into a coherent policy that actually thinks about some objectives and accomplishes them? So those are programs coming up. And as I said, if you give us your contact information, we'll get you those. And we hope that you'll be interested in joining us. With that, let me turn the program over to Jennifer Turner, the director of the China Environmental Forum.
And I'm really excited. This is my 3rd Wilson's on the Hill thing that I've done, and this is the first time I actually have a voice. The first time I sounded a bit like Mae West. Second time I had no voice, and he had to chair for me. So this morning I woke up and kind of did a few tests, and I'm happy to say I have a voice, and I'm really excited to see you all. I'm working on 2 of the speakers, the 2 at the end here, Denise and Bob. They actually gave a talk this morning at the center with where's Jim Jiang. Jim Jiang, he also talked as well. We put him to rest to the side and brought in Durwood Zaelke today. Today, as you saw from the title, Crouching Suspicions, Hidden Potential, looking at U.S.-China environmental health cooperation, the potential of that. But to let you know that the China Environment Forum, and I also reiterate, love to have you if you want to join my mafia. I'd be more than happy to have you on our list. We focus on energy and environmental issues and sometimes even food safety issues on China, and I can be very helpful if you're looking for context and information. Today's talk, as I said, is about looking at how and why is environmental health issues in China of interest to you guys. I'm actually kind of excited because the tables are all full, so you guys kind of got it, that there's a reason why you should come today and learn. So today, I'm going to keep it short, though, is that we have a panel of environmental health experts who are going to talk about how and why the U.S. needs to better understand the nexus of climate, air pollution, and health in China, in part because it does open avenues for dialogue and mutually beneficial cooperation. We deal with environmental health problems here as well. You have the bios, but just 1, 2, 3 ticking off here, a little bit about them. Bob O'Keefe from the Health Effects Institute up in Boston is a unique nonprofit organization that looks globally at environmental health issues and promoting studies around the world. And Bob, he manages the key initiatives, particularly in Asia and Latin America. We also have Denise Mauzerall, who's an associate professor of environmental engineering and international affairs at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. That's a very long title. But most notably, she's at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, which we're always confused with. But should note that, I mean, she is an expert on focusing on black carbon and environmental health issues, but I wanted to note that she was one of the many thousands in the IPCC that got that Nobel Peace Prize a few years ago. Good for that. Durwood Zaelke, he's the president and founder of the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development here in D.C. He's got a really long bio, too, but I think it's note for kind of the angle he'll be talking about today is his current research focusing on fast action mitigation strategies to respond to abrupt climate change to strengthen the implementation and enforcement of international environmental laws. Okay, I'm going to stop because you guys want to hear them. And I'm also very unrealistic. I've asked them, demanded that they speak for 5 minutes. They did produce some really nice handouts. Some are on the table, some are in the hall. But then we have a lot of time for Q&A. Okay, you guys still munching well? Ears open still, though? I have a 4-year-old. Can you guys listen? All right, let's go.
Hi, I'm Denise Mauzerall. Thanks for coming. I'm glad to be here. You have my handout on the table, I think, in front of you. It's only 2 pages, so I should be able to do it in 5 minutes. My goal is to convey to you the importance of looking at co-benefits. Air pollutants affect climate change as well as affecting health. And strategic reductions in certain air pollutants are beneficial to climate, and certain reductions in others are detrimental to climate. If you look at the first page, on the first side, you'll see on the left a figure which actually shows you, if you can read the very fine print, the radiative forcing of the long-lived greenhouse gases in the top panel, air pollutants in the middle panel, and then aerosols in the bottom panel. And the thing I want to convey is that tropospheric ozone warms the climate, black carbon warms the climate, and aerosols like sulfate and organic carbon cool the climate. And so emphasis that has very legitimately existed so far on reducing sulfur dioxide emissions in order to reduce acid deposition and to improve health by reducing particulate concentrations in the atmosphere is actually reducing the cooling effect of those aerosols. And so we're essentially shutting the umbrella and exposing ourselves to the full warming of the long-lived greenhouse gases by reducing sulfur emissions. We should reduce sulfur emissions for the health and ecological benefits that brings us, but we also really need to take advantage of the opportunity we have to reduce other short-lived greenhouse agents. I think particularly black carbon, because it is very strong radiative forcing agent. Radiative forcing is essentially the amount of heat that the atmosphere traps by having these compounds in it. So black carbon is a very strong radiative forcing agent, and it has clear detrimental effects on health. So there's great opportunities to protect public health in the U.S., and especially in developing countries where black carbon emissions are large and potentially growing substantially. There's some key opportunities presented by black carbon mitigation. It's got a short lifetime and a high radiative forcing. And what that basically means is that each particle warms a lot, but it doesn't stay in the atmosphere for very long. When it rains, it falls out and gets removed. Its lifetime is on the order of a week. So as you shut off your emissions, the concentrations in the atmosphere drop to zero virtually immediately compared to compounds like carbon dioxide or the other long-lived greenhouse gases, which stick around for decades, centuries, in some cases even millennia. Black carbon is emitted from a variety of combustion sources. I wanted to differentiate for you the difference between contained combustion and uncontained combustion. The difference is important because organic carbon, which is another aerosol, gets co-emitted with black carbon, and organic carbon is much lighter in color and cools. I have little pictures here. You can see black carbon coming out of the truck. It's very black, and you can see smoke coming from a fire, a forest fire, and you can see that smoke actually looks a bit whitish. That's because the ratio of black carbon to organic carbon is relatively low in uncontained combustion fires, open fires, but very high in combustion from diesel engines. There's, in the U.S., opportunities to mitigate black carbon. You can target the transport sector, particularly diesel retrofits. They appear to be cost-effective for health reasons, even though in absolute terms they're expensive. Improve fuel efficiency, locating super emitters, reducing emissions from them, reducing off-road vehicle emissions, and fuel switching away from diesel engines. In developing countries, there's great opportunities, I think, especially to control emissions from not only existing diesels, but also from future transport, diesels in future transport. If you look at Asian projections for vehicle numbers, they're virtually exponential, a factor of 4 increase in the next couple of decades. And if those vehicles all come online as diesels without particulate filters, we're really going to have a big impact of emissions there. There's a lot of discussion about reducing emissions from stoves, biomass stoves. I think there you get some benefit for climate, but they emit more organic carbon than diesel engines do, so the benefit for climate's there, but not as strong. Clear, definite benefit for health. In case you're not familiar with the net effect of changing air pollution emissions on global climate, it's quite substantial. The projections are that sulfur dioxide emissions are going to continue to go down because there are scrubbers being put on power plants in the US and in Europe now fairly ubiquitously, but increasingly in Asia. So sulfur is going to go down. The projections are black carbon will go up, ozone will go up. And if you flip the page over to the second side and you look at the second panel on the top right, this is a global model simulation done as part of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program at the a climate lab in Princeton, the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics lab. And you can see the change in those short-lived air pollutants resulting in substantial warming to the tune of 1 to 3 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, the units aren't written there. But with a significant warming, according to this model simulation in the central U.S. I want to just emphasize that this is indicative. It's just one model simulation so far. This work is ongoing. It's just published. But it's something to be alert to, that air pollutants and that changing concentration of air pollutants will have a big effect on climate. I go here through just a couple of other things showing you how background ozone concentrations are increasing. Ozone will also have an effect on climate. And one way to reduce ozone concentrations globally is to reduce methane. The advantage of reducing methane is it is itself a greenhouse gas, and it's a precursor for ozone. So reductions in methane lead to reductions in ozone. Ozone has detrimental impacts not only on human health, but also on agricultural yields. And some work that we've done has shown that agricultural yields in areas with high ozone concentrations, especially East Asia, we project will decrease quite substantially in the next 20 years as ozone levels there grow. You look at the second figure down on the right on that second page, you can see the projections into the future, 2100 minus 2000. You're looking there at an increase in concentrations of about 50 parts per billion. The figure in that on the left there shows you the trends in ozone concentrations from about 1870 on the left at 10 parts per billion up through the present at about 50 parts per billion in Europe. So we're looking at potentially an additional doubling in Eastern China, in Eastern Asia of ozone concentrations. So just in conclusion, I want to emphasize again, air pollutants play a major role in climate change and should be viewed as a short-term lever in climate stabilization strategies. They've got short lifetime, strong radiative forcings. If we change their concentrations, we can get an immediate benefit. There's opportunities for co-benefits. Black carbon emissions reductions from contained combustion have clear co-benefits for health and climate. Methane emission reductions would decrease climate warming and surface ozone concentrations globally, providing co-benefits for climate, human health, and agricultural yields. And then increases in efficiency and the use of renewable energy reduce emissions of both reactive air pollutants and carbon dioxide, a clear win-win situation. However, I want to emphasize that reducing methane and black carbon emissions should be viewed as a companion rather than an alternative to reducing CO2 emissions. as reducing CO2 emissions is essential for long-term stabilization of climate. If you want any additional information, the last slide has my website where you can get various papers on this topic. And then also I led a workshop at the Woodrow Wilson School this past semester on black carbon, a review and policy recommendations. The electronic form is available on my website. I have a very few copies here. If anyone wants a hard copy, please see me afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you. And we're going fast, but we will have plenty of time for Q&A, and we're going to have Durwood.
So I'll jump in. Okay, Denise is always great, and I agree with everything she said. It's absolutely spot on. I want to back up just for a second, though, and present a slightly broader perspective where black carbon fits in. And the perspective is this, that as of 2005 emissions, we've committed the world to warming of about 2.4 degrees. And that's 0.76 that we can see today. That's what we're already getting climate impacts from, plus another 1 degree of warming that's hidden by the cooling aerosols that Denise mentioned, and then about half a degree that's lagged in oceans. There's a 5 to 10% chance that that committed warming is actually much larger. It could be 5 degrees Celsius that we're committed to as of 2005 emissions. This would be disastrous. If you plot even 2.4 degrees of committed warming over predicted temperature tipping points, you see that we are in the danger zone today. So this is danger for public health, it's danger for national security, it's danger for everything in civilization. The first tipping point we're going to see is the loss of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. Already almost gone. When you lose that, you expose the dark water, it absorbs more heat, it threatens to liberate the methane in the permafrost and the methane hydrates. We would stabilize again if that happens at about 9 degrees Celsius. So if we lose the methane hydrates and the methane and permafrost, that's runaway feedback, and that's not a world we want to be living in. Second is Greenland ice sheet. Al Gore talks about this. We lose the Greenland ice sheet, we have 6 to 7 meters of sea level rise. We will be underwater here, most likely. Maybe we're in the basement, I think. Okay, so bad news coming. The next is relevant for China and India. That's the 500,000 square kilometers of snow and ice in the Himalayan Hindu Kush Tibetan Plateau. That is predicted within 20 years to be 80% gone. That's a conservative prediction from the IPCC. 80% gone. That is the headwaters that supplies every major river of Asia. Maybe 3 billion people depend on this for their dry season irrigation. You lose that, and you have 3 nuclear powers fighting for dwindling water supplies. You have mass migration, you have climate chaos. This is, again, public health disaster, but it's a disaster for the world. Okay, then you move on to the Amazon die-off. 2.5 degrees, we lose all of our forest, except boreal forest. They move north, and they reduce the albedo of the north, and so we may lose the reflectivity and have more climate change because of that. All right, so this is indeed bad news. But that's not where the story ends, because I'll pick up where Denise presented black carbon. There is good news here. Well, let me finish the bad news. The one last piece of bad news is that while we must cut CO2 emissions, absolutely essential, cutting CO2 emissions does not produce significant cooling for at least 1,000 years. Okay? At least 1,000 years. This is not good news. But CO2 is only 50% of what causes climate change. The other 50% is where we need to add additional focus. These are complementary measures. We must do both. The first one is black carbon. Denise mentioned its power. I'll add the fact that it is causing an estimated 50% of the warming in the Arctic. The Arctic is now 1.9 degrees above the global average, above pre-industrial average, as opposed to 0.76 for the global average. 1.9. So 50% of that warming is from black carbon from 1890 forward, a higher percentage since 1970s. So reducing black carbon north of 40 degrees latitude is very, very important for saving the Arctic, or at least delaying the demise of the Arctic. Okay, second, after black carbon, is, and we expect also black carbon has the same effect in the Himalayan Hindu Kush Tibetan Plateau. That's warming about 3 times the global average. Black carbon is implicated there as well. So, and of the committed warming, 90% is going to be manifest within the next 50 years. So it's coming fast. You get black carbon, and then you get the tropospheric ozone that Denise mentioned. You get methane. Methane can produce cooling on a decadal time scale. And then you also get the HFCs, the hydrochlorofluorocarbons, and these are currently under the Montreal Protocol, under the Kyoto Protocol, but there is an effort right now to move them over to the Montreal Protocol to reduce them there. The Montreal Protocol, in case you don't know, is the ozone treaty, and it has produced already about 135 billion tons of CO2 mitigation, 11 gigatons per year. That's 10 to 11 times more than what we're trying to get out of Kyoto. Huge benefit for climate. If we move the HFCs over, as has been proposed by several countries, we would be able to phase down the high GWP HFCs, and we could get 11 gigatons of CO2 climate mitigation. Now, just to put this in by 2040, to put this in perspective, there's a study coming out shortly that shows that 11 gigatons of HFC climate equivalent mitigation will be 1/3 of total climate emissions by 2040. In other words, the Montreal Protocol could solve what will be 1/3 of total climate emissions by 2040. And I mentioned Montreal over and over again because it has already phased out 97 chemicals by 97%, and it has never failed to do its job. Final point that I'll mention before mentioning the congressional bills is biochar. Okay, biochar is an ancient Amazonian practice where you turn organic material into fine-grained charcoal. And in doing so, you get bio-oil, biogas, and biochar that can produce permanent carbon storage. You can put it back into the soil. It's been used for centuries as a soil enhancement, but recently we've discovered that it also provides permanent carbon storage. There is one effort that says, this is led by Tim Flannery in Australia, and James Lovelock of the Gaia hypothesis, that says we could actually take out all of the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere since pre-industrial times, that's about 100 parts per million, through biochar in the next century. So we could go back to pre-industrial levels. We don't know whether this is possible. We don't have all the science data yet, but we're gathering it now. A lot of the agricultural schools in the United States are studying this. Very good thing for your districts to be promoting because it could be very, very important as an offset. There's a black carbon bill in the House from Inslee, a black carbon bill in the Senate from Kerry and Boxer and Inhofe, carried over from last year. These are study bills that then say regulate when you find that this is bad for black carbon, which we will. We'll just confirm that. And then in the Waxman-Markey bill, of course, there's a separate title on black carbon, which also includes a cook stove provision, and then there's a separate title on the HFCs as well to phase them out. So I would encourage you all to be studying those and supporting those. Thanks.
Now bring it on round to China, Bertone.
Bring it on home.
Bring it on home.
It's always nice to know that people are here just to hear the speaker and the food has nothing to do with it.
Stop chewing. It's just you
That's
now.
a good sign. One of the challenges in doing these kinds of talks is, without PowerPoint, is you print out 6 to a page and it's, I'll just talk from this. And then you look at the 6 to a page and it's like, I'm 54 years old. I can't read this anymore. So in any case, thanks for having me. And where I'll pick this up is, you've heard why co-benefits are important. And where I'd like to pick this up is to say that benefits from reducing greenhouse gases, selling those can be a problem in China and in other developing countries. Not that they're always an easy sell in the United States. A big problem is that they can seem especially distant from developing countries because of their near-term economic needs. However, if we have a goal of demonstrating to the Chinese and others in Asia that health-based reductions in traditional air pollutants, such as black carbon, such as ozone, such as methane, are a very cost-effective way to both reduce health effects in local populations, but also begin to reduce or enable concurrent reductions in greenhouse gases as well. And the way we do that at HEI, and this is a short outline there for you, is to point out to them that the global burden of disease assessment conducted by WHO finds that Asian cities have the highest air pollution in the world, bar none. The second way we pointed out to them is to say, actually that was the air quality guidelines from WHO, point out that they have the highest air pollution in the world, bar none, and that the WHO global burden of disease finds that the highest death rates from PM10 around the world is in India and in China, with a collective total of over 530,000 excess mortalities per year. So there's a fairly strong incentive to demonstrate to the Asian populations that there are effects there. There are a lot of problems in China, and I'm sure we'll talk about those in our discussion, but I did want to note along the way that China has made some progress in some areas. They started late on vehicle standards, and as the chart in front of you shows, they've really caught up and now are approaching Euro 5 and are pretty close to the United States and Europe in many places. They took lead out of gasoline before it actually had widespread population exposure, so you didn't see the problems in China in children as you did in the United States and in Europe. And they've also lowered their fuel sulfur to enable new technologies to come to market, and they're actually aggressively pursuing battery electric hybrids in an attempt to leapfrog the United States. Having said that, there's a lot more to be done. Among the challenges in China is that the Ministry of Environmental Protection is quite weak. They've been elevated in the power structure, but they're very understaffed, and they have hundreds of employees relative to EPA's thousands for a country that is obviously much more populated. They have a really difficult problem with central to regional governance, so enforcement is very difficult, and there are significant problems in Western China especially. And one of the bottom lines here, or an overarching issue for this discussion, is that calls for reductions in traditional and greenhouse gases based on science in Western populations really seems somewhat distant and less relevant. Frankly, they say, why should I care about a Western study in Ohio in terms of health effects in China? It just doesn't really sell. So the goal that the approach that HEI has taken is one part of this larger effort, is to provide new science in local populations. I don't have time to go into that today, but we have a whole suite of studies across Asia which provides evidence to local policymakers that there are indeed effects in Chinese populations in places that have never been studied before. And that really provides a very different kind of incentive. Secondly, by linking these studies to the very extensive Western literature that's been developed over the last 50 years on air pollution and health, one can begin to extrapolate in a credible way, and the Chinese can realize that that literature is relevant again to their own populations. So those local effects taken with the linkage to the Western literature can create an incentive for them to react in their own self-interest to achieve the significant cost savings in avoided health costs by reducing things like particulates, which is has a very strong relationship to black carbon, and at the same time that creates an incentive to reduce greenhouse gases, the so-called co-benefits approach. That's the nature of the argument here. I don't have time to go in and tell you about the studies that we have underway, except to say that we're doing it in a wonderful capacity-building way where Western investigators from the United States are working with Chinese in a highly credible way that creates a lot of goodwill. So it's been a good approach. It's one part of this larger discussion that we're talking about.
Thank you very much. So, David, with the Q&A, do they need to have a mic so they can hear on the? There's a mic. Okay, we got a mic. Maybe Lyndon, Elizabeth do it. Okay, so raise your hand. We ask for members of Congress to get first dibs. Or congressional staffer, sorry. Low blood sugar stuff. I have a voice but no brain. And then just say who you are as well, and then open up. Hard questions, welcome. Okay, go.
She doesn't have to answer them.
I'm Wayne.
It won't amplify. It's just for recording purposes only.
Oh, okay. I'm Wayne Morrison with the Congressional Research Service. The U.S. and China have engaged on environmental issues with a strategic economic dialogue, and I was wondering if you could comment on what they've achieved on that. And secondly, if you could identify some of the major impediments to closer U.S.-China cooperation on this issue. Is it, for example, problems with technology transfer, Or is it problems having to do with, IPR protection, things of that nature? What are the major impediments? Thanks.
She said she wanted hard questions. We didn't agree to that, but we'll. I know that's a question that's largely outside of my scope, but I'll make a couple of comments on it. I think there's tremendous opportunity to broaden U.S.-China's bilateral engagement, and that includes right now the State Department, for example, is doing a study or a project that I'm assisting with to reduce fluorocarbons from Chinese aluminum smelters. And we're doing 2 or 3. And that you do this by changing an algorithm in computer programs. So it's relatively straightforward to do. China has 80 to 88 aluminum smelters. Nobody is sure how many, and it depends on what day you count. But this could be an example of something that's expanded. The Asia-Pacific partnership, which this is being done under, has been quite good, I think, and should be expanded further. So I see tremendous opportunities, and includes the black carbon that we've all talked about today, but it also includes the other short-term forcers and other areas where there are strong co-benefits. China has so far been reluctant to engage on black carbon as part of climate discussions because they moved from being the victim of the West's CO2 emissions historically to being the largest emitter of black carbon. So that's not a good posture to be in. But for public health purposes, absolutely. And I suspect if we start that way, we'll then end up counting the climate benefits shortly thereafter and adding them to the ledger of commitments or actions that developed countries and developing countries are undertaking.
Let me jump in real quick since I am the China Environment Forum head. One thing to say is that, when I know when you ask the question about the impediments to U.S.-China environmental cooperation that you're focusing on government, bilateral government. But I should say first that actually the U.S. NGO community has been extremely active, and U.S. foundations in supporting research projects and on-the-ground initiatives. I mean, Natural Resources Defense Council, I build a little platform to them every day. They've been doing amazing work on promoting energy cooperation, and they brought together the state of California and Jiangsu province to do demand-side management work together, and really helping. I mean, our U.S. NGOs have actually, in many ways, I think, over the last 8-9 years or so, been doing a lot more to really build the capacity of Chinese policymakers and researchers. But I think that personal opinion, so that I think that the U.S. government, our agencies, EPA folks, they have been there. They have been doing research, but there has not been really consistent, high-level support for this kind of work. And Marin's mentioned that, the Chinese don't need money from us, but I think that the kind of cooperation, the great work by EPA in helping them design regional environmental protection offices, that's got a huge impact to kind of address some of the main environmental governance challenges. I think that for the cooperation, it's not, IPR is a big concern, obviously, but I think that some of it is just simply having constant, regular contact, enable our, U.S. government officials being able to fly over to China, because there's often not the budget for that. How's that for like the 30 seconds?
I might add one more piece to that, actually. I'd reinforce that. And like any other country, it takes long-term sets of relationships to build trust. And I'd second what Jennifer said about EPA in their regional air quality management meetings to develop the trust to put in place an environmental infrastructure that's starting to pay dividends. I'd also say that there was a real loss in the United States' ability to interact with China when the USAID essentially withdrew all of its funding for any air-related work 4 or 5 years ago to only focus on water, and at the same time abolished the U.S.-Asia Environmental Partnership. They were the on-the-ground U.S. representatives dealing with environmental issues in Asia, and there's a real loss there. So that would be something that I think could come back.
Yeah, my name is Anna Bertone from the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and there was an article recently. It said the Britain climate secretary had just been to China and said that China was ready to do business in international negotiations to create a new treaty. And it seems pretty obvious that China is very committed to reducing energy intensity, energy per unit of GDP. But how does this translate into effects in reducing greenhouse gases and impacting climate change?
I can address that issue. If the economy continues to grow and energy intensity drops, you can still have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's no commitment whatsoever to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The commitment to reduce energy intensity is something that President Bush made. You actually normally see as the economy develops, the energy intensity drop. And so in the case of President Bush, we did reduce energy intensity slightly, but we would have expected to do that without any additional initiatives whatsoever. And China could also expect to see their energy intensity drop without any explicit efforts to mitigate climate change.
Yeah, I'll make one more comment about that. I mean, China does seem, and this was a comment by Ed Miliband from the UK, China does seem very aware of the climate change problem that it faces. And it is taking steps, probably more than many of us realize, to address it. Part of this is going to be whether we allow developing countries to simply do actions instead of formal legal commitments. Part of it's going to have to do with what the United States comes up with for its own offer, its own commitment. And right now, the initial commitment that has been offered by Todd Stern is not that aggressive. And so we need to think about adding to the CO2 side. So the initial offer is 20% below 2005. That gets you about 5 to 6% maybe below 1990 compared to the European offer of 20% below or 30% below if others will go along. So, and then moving down, peaking, and then moving down to 80% below 1990 by 2050. So if we add the non-CO2 side in a more aggressive way and get our offer up higher in the international negotiations, we'll be able to push China, India, and other developing countries much further along as well. But if we don't, then they're not going to feel the pressure.
Can I add one more thing to my comment, which is that although I stand behind what I said so far, it is the case that if energy intensity doesn't come down, greenhouse gas emissions would go up even more. And so reducing energy intensity is a very important and positive first step. It's not sufficient to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, but China is a developing country, and I think there's a legitimate claim that they need to have some latitude to develop. So reducing energy intensity is important. It's just not enough.
Yeah, Chia Chen, freelance correspondent. Denise, you make a very comprehensive and concise conclusion. If I may, I would like to make some suggestion for the first conclusion. First, that air pollutants play a major role in climate change and should be viewed as a short-term lever in climate stabilization strategy. I would like to suggest maybe change a short-term to a sustainable. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you.
My name's Vincent. I'm with Congressman Elsie Hastings' office. I just, could you address China's position on the cap-and-trade program, and also arguments that if the U.S. introduces such a program, then production will simply shift to places like China?
Yes, this is a very, very tough question. I mean, we are concerned, of course, about whether we can have a truly global carbon market at some point. And we're concerned probably even more about the competitiveness impacts. And we have seen some migration of industry over the years as developed countries in the OECD have tightened restrictions. And that's just something that we're going to have to factor into the negotiations. I'll be happy to chat further after lunch about that with you.
Add that but in China, just domestically, when you look at their domestic energy policy, I mean, the question, that they are improving energy intensity, but there really is a big push I mean, because again, a lot of it led by not just the health costs, but the economic costs. And so I think that I mean, I'm not saying that industries won't go there, but that Chinese laws are getting stricter. They have an energy conservation law that we think has teeth now. The potential is that in another year, some provinces who don't meet energy efficiency targets, that the provincial head will lose his or her job. I wait, I listen, I look and see. You know, I mean, but it's just that in some ways that local governments are really feeling the pressure, because there's pressure coming down on them, but also the fact that there's a lot of brownouts. I mean, that they need energy. I mean, they have a lot of cheap coal, but they can't always get it to their market. So I mean, that there's a lot of dynamics happening domestically in China that I think it's important for us to pay attention to, that it's not just they're saying, you really don't hear anymore in China as much, pollute first, clean up later. Because, I mean, they are seeing, I mean, the health impacts. I mean, the Olympics had the fact that the skies were blue for a bit. It was an amazing thing. And then we had people like, you know, Dr. Zhang, who spoke this morning about he and others doing studies that, you know, showing that, hey, people are getting healthier, less asthma attacks. And I think that is resonating with the Chinese public. And there's laws on open information. They have a kind of a green freedom of information act of sorts underneath a broader measure. So, and people are asking for information. So I think that the domestic dynamics around air pollution in particular have changed quite a bit from just even 5 years ago. And I think that, whether or not the Chinese people want to have dirty industries moving in, protests are increasing significantly over it. So I'll stop now, because I will go on forever otherwise. Other questions out in the audience? We've terrified you. Some other comments or questions? Yeah, David.
I guess I introduced myself, David Klaus with the Wilson Center on the Hill program. Just a question. To a certain extent, you mentioned a couple bills, Inslee's bill and others, that have sort of talked and looked at the issue of black carbon. I mean, to a certain, isn't there a criticism that says, isn't this kind of like changing the target? That we've had the entire climate debate so focused on CO2 and everything, and to the extent that people have been involved in that, they've been focused on CO2 and how do we deal with this long-term problem. Why is this whole discussion of black carbon and all that stuff seeming to be a tail that isn't even attached to the dog yet? Why is that? Are we shifting targets? Is that should that really be what the Energy and Commerce Committee is focused on, marking up instead of what they've got in front of them?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. We've focused, I would say, inordinately on CO2 emissions, almost to the exclusion of the other forcers. And that's only half. And we now realize that cutting CO2, while absolutely essential, will not produce cooling for at least 1,000 years. So you're forced to look at the broader sources of climate forcing. And the good news is that 50% could be, Hansen says it's probably closer to 60%, but that side, which you have to do to win the climate game, allows you to think of it as more like a relay race, where you get some of these short-term forcers out quickly. And Denise mentioned that black carbon stays in the atmosphere only days to a week. So this is, you can go from high temperature to lower temperature almost instantaneously. This is very important to understand when you're looking at the committed warming, already putting us in the path of the freight train. I mean, I don't think that the science has caught up to the policy, or the policy, rather, hasn't caught up to the science.
Is this recent?
Well, it's becoming more and more accepted. Yes, so I would say it is fairly recent. And so you got to do both. And I think the policymakers are beginning to understand that. They're also beginning to understand that, cap and trade, while we're committed to this for much of the world for dealing with CO2, is still an experiment at scale. The European cap and trade system has not yet proven itself to be that effective. And so using traditional regulatory measures on the non-CO2 side is a way to guarantee faster and more precise mitigation, buy us a little more time, give us a little more security.
Actually, let me add something to that. First, removing any of these compounds right now, you're not going to get cooling. You're just going to get less warming. So we're looking ahead at a situation where we haven't reached equilibrium yet with stuff that's in the atmosphere already. I make the analogy, if you're cold and you get into bed and you pull up a blanket, you don't get warm immediately. It takes a while for the heat that radiates off your body to get trapped in the blanket to warm you up. So that's why there's all this discussion of climate stabilization temperatures, equilibrium temperatures. The radiative forcing that you're getting from these things in the atmosphere are going to continue to basically act as a blanket for a while. The advantage of removing black carbon is that you basically are opening a hole in your blanket and you're letting that heat radiate back out to space. With CO2, you don't have that option. The reason I think that this hasn't been at the forefront so far is that undoubtedly climate change is a long-term problem. You have to continue to focus on these long-lived gases, or our planet will overheat in the future. And I think we should care about the future. But the scientific reason that perhaps they haven't been on the front burner sooner is that running these global climate models is a very complicated endeavor. And the computational time required is huge. So doing the long-lived gases is a much easier computational problem than doing the short-lived reactive radiative forcing agents that are regionally inhomogeneous. And as computational time has grown, as computers have gotten faster, and our understanding has improved, it's been more feasible to do those types of simulations. And so now that those simulations are beginning to be done, and it is quite new, it's becoming very clear if you look at the figure I had on the front with the little bars and then on the other side with the warming that's going to happen as a result of changing the concentrations of air pollutants. It's something that we should pay attention to now and take action on now, in addition to taking action on the long-lived agents.
One more piece I might add to that, and that from a policy perspective, it actually is something of a win-win-win situation, as opposed to some of the more difficult choices that are embedded in some of the other climate bills. Clearly, diesel is a major source of black carbon in different parts of the world, and the opportunity to do retrofits, the technology exists. There are significant health impacts with reducing black carbon, and there are significant climate benefits to reducing black carbon. And there's an industry that's in stress right now that could be selling a lot of this technology around the world, that they would very much embrace that opportunity. Also, the numbers that I put up there on outdoor air pollution are dwarfed by the mortality and respiratory issues associated with indoor air pollution associated with these biomass stoves. And there could be a significant contribution to both public health and black carbon reduction by following through on that particular provision. So there's some good news here.
I'll add one further thing. The black carbon has come into focus more as well because of the Arctic and the Himalayan Hindu Kush Tibetan Plateau, where we're getting huge impacts from the black carbon, both as the aerosol and as it's deposited on the snow and ice, and reduces the albedo and increases the warming. So we're learning that it's hurting us tremendously in certain regions of the world.
I have a question for Jennifer and Robert and Durwood. You know, it seems to me when you're talking about cooperation with Chinese side, it is very reluctant for the Chinese side at different level of EPA refuse to release some kind of data, important data. It costs some of our academics spend so much time for doing so. So what is the best way for doing that? The second question is Jennifer talking about the role of NGOs. What is the practical way for NGO can do for this kind of cooperation? The third one is we know during the Olympic Games, Peking model seems to me as a kind of reduction of air pollution model. Can you share with me some what kind of concrete role Chinese did during this period of time?
There's a lot of questions there. I'll just touch on the first and the last, if that's okay, quickly. The data is always a challenge, and the Chinese are very sensitive to lots of issues. I think we've had great success in funding the studies that we did. We actually required the people who came to us, the Chinese and Asian teams who applied to us to have very strong connections to their environmental protection bureaus and to local health bureaus, so that they could both get access to data and that they'd have credible relationships, so that at the end of the day the studies that they conducted would be acted on. That took a little bit of extra time, and it unfolded over a few years, but we didn't have any data access problems. And we actually sent in auditors to look at the quality of the data on our particular studies, and we did pretty well. That's not always the case, and there are times when data is obscured, so I take your point. We had a nice discussion with a presentation by Jim Jiang this morning on an HEI-funded study on the health impacts of the Beijing Olympics. And the measures that the Chinese took in this one particular case were really quite draconian. And they began some 9 years before the Olympics started, when they first were awarded the city to hold the Olympics, and they went right up not only to ensure that the air was clean for the games, but to put in place some permanent reductions, which included facility relocations, traffic control measures, fuel switching, street sweeping during the Olympics every day. Very draconian. They were so draconian that actually, when I gave a talk in the UK, the chief UK air regulator said, "Gee, I'd really like a copy of your slides for what the Chinese did in Beijing." I said, "Sure, why?" "Because my bosses keep bothering me about, getting our air as clean as it was in Beijing, and I want to tell them it's really hard, and you can't afford to do all these things." So, which is pretty interesting. But the weather helped them a lot. But in that one case, they did very well. The real challenge is, what are they going to do in the other parts of China? Are they going to maintain those controls even in Beijing in some of the discretionary areas?
Maybe on the NGO one, in terms of, I don't know if you're asking, well, first of all, if we're talking climate issues, there aren't very many Chinese NGOs that are working on climate yet. There's smaller initiatives starting. The NGO, there's a lot of political space for green work in China, but a lot of it's been capacity, because Chinese NGOs have only been around since 1994. But in terms of international NGOs, in 1990, you had a whole huge group of international groups going and working on energy issues, Energy Foundation, Natural Resources Defense Council, EDF. And they've done a lot. I mentioned building capacity of not only the researchers and the policymakers, but they've really acted as, in their projects, as important glue, bringing in communities, NGOs, government, and kind of creating new policy dynamics, and really creating kind of innovation, I think, in the policy sphere. And I think particularly Energy Foundation, has probably been behind a lot of the new energy laws that they've had over the past 8 years. That's kind of a good thing to put on your portfolio. Some other questions out here? We've got a few more minutes. Said you could still ask. There's David again.
The follow-up question I was going to ask. One question is has black carbon not been an issue in the U.S. debate because the U.S. seems to do relatively well on it? Because we've done a lot of things over the last 20 years with regards to our energy policy that has substantially reduced, closed, open burning and a lot of that stuff. The question I'd have is, what's the relative cost of taking these sorts of attacking this piece of the climate change problem as compared to attacking the CO2? And I ask that because I know that getting diesels out of the system is not an easy thing to do. It's something that's been very expensive, and diesel controls have been very difficult to get because you have to have catches, and you have to deal with them, and they're not self-sustaining and things like this. Similarly, if you're talking about changing the way in which the entire Chinese population heats their homes, or developing countries heat, you're talking about very dramatic and expensive, potentially expensive changes and massive infrastructure changes. How's the cost comparison, or what's the relative challenge of tackling this piece of the climate change problem when you compare it with the other?
So let me take a crack at that just a little bit. You're right. The U.S. has done a relatively good job with black carbon. Our diesel engines have particulate filters on them on road, and there's now regulations to put particulate filters increasingly on off-road engines. Those could be strengthened, and I think certainly targeting super emitters is a good way to reduce black carbon emissions in a relatively cost-effective way in the U.S. But most of the black carbon emissions are coming from developing countries in Asia, and in the future even more will. And so I see there as a great opportunity to make sure that the vehicles they're putting on the road have the appropriate fuel so that they can actually run the diesel particulate filters, or use a different type of engine so that you don't have those black carbon emissions. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's more fuel efficient. But you get more miles per gallon, and so it's attractive in that respect. For stoves, there's been efforts actually even by the Chinese government to develop cleaner stoves, and that type of work could continue with great benefits for health. I mean, as well as benefits for climate. The use of coal and briquettes for cooking and heating. I mean, there's opportunities there to clean up those sources, as well as industrial sources where you could put filters on. I think that there, it's actually the cost might be relatively small, but I haven't done the economic analyses.
Can I interject on the cook stoves? I mean, China they did do, a few years ago, had someone from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab coming and talking about how they actually worked with the Chinese government, did a massive 7-province study of the health impacts, and after that, there was massive, intervention. I mean, throughout China, there are a lot of Chinese in rural areas that need these new cook stoves, and there's a lot of difficulties. You don't just hand it to them and walk away. But the Chinese themselves have been taking this quite seriously, and they see it as a livelihood and promoting development in rural areas.
Yeah, a couple of more comments. I mean, cost benefit. I mean, if you add the public health benefits as well as the climate benefits, and if you add as well a premium for the speed that you can get reductions from black carbon and the change in the forcing, I think you find it to be a very attractive proposition. And the closer we get to the cliffs of the tipping points, the better we should be able to pull that lever and move backwards. So it's a question now of getting the pieces in place. Some of them are there. They need to be rationalized. They need to be expanded. And when the panic sets in, then we'll have the political will to pull the lever harder.
The last piece on that, I guess, is retrofits are expensive, and to go on a massive retrofit program would cost a lot of money. Looking forward, there's remarkable diesel technology that exists in the United States and Europe. In the U.S., under the 2007 and 2010 diesel rule, we're actually doing health effect studies of this new technology, and the emissions are so low that we're having trouble keeping the animals alive due to the heat from the engine, as opposed to the levels of particulates in the exhaust. So there's been remarkable progress on these technologies. So going forward, if one one's going to say, well, what kind of diesel technology does China choose? And that's going to make a significant difference over time, with a little bit of a different, it's not quite as draconian as a broad-based retrofit program.
So I was just wondering, the black carbon, 50% of the emissions, right? And I was just wondering, what kind of legislation would you guys recommend for that? Like a cap and trade kind of thing, or something else?
Actually, for those people who are interested in black carbon, come get a report that I have here, and I'll answer your questions in more detail. One of the things that the students in the class did was we debated a lot about cap and trade for black carbon, and the general consensus is now that that's probably not the optimal way to go. You have so many distributed sources, it's very difficult to figure out how do you cap them, and certainly how do you trade them. It would be a very complicated market to even conceive of setting up. So in this case, I think sectoral controls, more along the lines of particulate filter requirements for diesel engines, might make more sense. So a technology-based type of regulatory approach rather than a cap-and-trade type of approach.
Yeah, there is not an accepted global warming potential yet for black carbon. There may never be. And if you don't agree on that, it's almost impossible to put it into a basket of gases where you do have the agreed global warming potential and you can determine equivalency. So I think it is something that should be addressed much more effectively through regulatory measures, as Denise mentioned. Cookies left.
Are there any cookies? No, I don't have more questions. we need the mic because they record it to the
Behind you?
right behind you.
Good. Dale Everett's Environmental Protection Agency. And Denise, I know you showed this morning some information on the effects of, didn't get a chance to talk about it here, but the effects of background levels of ozone, another short-lived climate-forcing pollutant, on crops in the world. Could you comment on that? That might be of interest here.
Sure. So tropospheric ozone, surface ozone, is different than stratospheric ozone. So stratospheric ozone you want, it protects the Earth from ultraviolet radiation. Montreal Protocol protects it. Surface ozone is part of smog. It's bad for human health, causes cardiopulmonary problems, and it's bad for vegetation and crop yields. Crop yields are reduced quite dramatically depending on the particular crop, to a greater or lesser degree as ozone concentrations go up. And we've taken the National Crop Loss Assessment Network metrics of concentration and yield reduction and applied them to East Asia. And we see by 2020, yield reductions dropping quite dramatically. In the United States, ozone is known to be probably the air pollutant that has the largest adverse impact on crop yields. And so there's an opportunity here. Ozone is a greenhouse gas. If you can lower ozone concentrations, you have a benefit for food production globally, which is very helpful for a world with a growing population. And an opportunity to reduce ozone concentrations globally is to reduce methane emissions. Which methane's a greenhouse gas. It's a precursor for ozone. You get a co-benefit there. Reduce methane, reduce ozone, get increased crop yields, and help meet the national ambient air quality standards in the U.S. for ozone.
And she had a great slide that talked about did this model and looked at how it would impact the crops specifically in China. And those of it in the China mafia who look at also like the water challenges. And so if you laid the decrease in crops, the map in China, it looks pretty scary by 2030. But if you lay on top of that the water pollution, the water shortages, the soil degradation, which is already impacting crops throughout China, is that's a really scary scenario. And I think are we ending negative? Oh dear.
Mm-hmm.
So
There's lots of work to be done.
Lots of work to be done. Any other final comments from you guys over there? They seem well-fed and well-educated, brains stretched a little bit today. I strongly encourage, we will have all their full PowerPoints that they did is on the China Environment Forum website right now, I believe. It will be soon, by this afternoon. And don't hesitate to come up and tackle them gently. Thank you.
If anyone wants this report.